Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm going to wait a few moments to allow everyone to come in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Tom Hunter Pratt. I'm a multimedia specialist for the Institute of Child Nutrition, and I'll be helping facilitate today's webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone. I have a few announcements before we get started. At the end of our panelist presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you would, find the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom control panel and enter any questions that you have. You'll also notice on the Q&A panel that pops up, any questions that come through, you'll see a thumbs up button or an upvote button. If you really like a question that's been asked, you can go ahead and click on that, and that'll let us know. And so we'll see what the hot topic questions are, and we'll be able to go through those and answer those accordingly. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can as time permits. Also, at the end of the webinar, you will see a link pop up that will ask you to answer our survey, and your feedback is valuable to us, so we ask you go ahead and answer that and click through to our survey. You'll also get follow-up emails within 24 hours of the end of the webinar. And within that email, you'll get a link to this recording. You'll also get the same link to that survey in case you missed it at the end of this webinar. And there are also some other resource links in there as well. You'll also be getting a certificate within 24 hours of the end of the webinar, so be watching your inbox for that. That's all I've got for you. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Chef Garrett.
Thank you very much, Tom Hunter. Good afternoon. I'm Garrett Burdan with the Institute of Child Nutrition, and I would like to welcome you to the August 2022 CICN webinar, introducing the USDA Standardization Guide, introducing the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide for School Nutrition Programs. As a reminder, during today's webinar, all attendees are muted. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box on your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but due to our time constraints, every question may not get answered during the webinar. Individuals who have registered for the webinar will receive an email at the conclusion of the webinar. The email contains the webinar recording link and a link to the evaluation survey. Please complete the evaluation survey. The ICN will send out their certificates within 24 hours. To assist in meeting the unique training, technical assistance, and professional development needs of school nutrition professionals, ICN has launched the Culinary Institute of Child Nutrition Initiative. We work to help child nutrition professionals develop goals and implement best practices to improve the culinary aspect of program operations. Please visit the CICN online for tips and strategies for preparing and serving healthy, culinary-inspired school meals. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. Topics covered in today's webinar fall under key areas 1, 2, and 3, nutrition, operations, and administration, and meet the USDA Professional Standards Codes 1100, 2100, and 3200. The learning objective for today's webinar is describe the benefits of standardized recipes and the 3-phase approach for standardizing a recipe in a school nutrition program. Our first panelist today is Chella Cooper. Chella Cooper has been a child nutrition program operations specialist at the Maryland State Department of Education since 2017. She currently works on the USDA Foods Distribution Team, assisting Maryland schools with utilizing the annual entitlement value through direct delivery, processing, and the USDA DoD Fresh program options. Chella has over 25 years of experience in culinary and food systems, including agriculture, food manufacturing, hospitality and fine dining, culinary technical writing, pre-K through 12 food education, and USDA Food and Nutrition Service programs. Chella holds a Bachelor of Arts in English and Writing from the University of San Francisco and is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America at Greystone. In her free time, Chella enjoys birdwatching, community gardening, and traveling to visit family and friends. She has visited 46 of the 50 states so far. Our second panelist is Chef Patrick Garmong. Patrick has been in the food service industry for over 18 years. He is a graduate of the Institute of Culinary Education in Manhattan, New York. Previously, Patrick was the child nutrition director for the Ellensburg School District. Patrick has been the executive chef in various fields of the hospitality industry, including higher education, restaurants, and catering. Outside of work, he enjoys time with his family, waterfowling, golfing, and woodworking. Patrick is a strong advocate for the autism community and serves as a board member for the Kittitas County Court Advocates for Children, CASA program. And I will serve as the final panelist for today's webinar. To give you a brief background, I am a registered dietitian and chef with a passion for advancing school meal programs. In April 2021, I joined the Institute of Child Nutrition as an education and training specialist for the Culinary Institute of Child Nutrition. My 12 years in school nutrition includes consulting, culinary training, quantity recipe development, food communications, and marketing services. I have also worked as a child nutrition specialist with the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs and as the menu planner and area supervisor for Spokane Public Schools. In today's webinar, we will cover what is a standardized recipe and why is it important to use them in school nutrition programs. We'll have an introduction to the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide for school nutrition programs. We'll learn how to standardize a recipe using a three-phase approach. We'll learn the components of a standardized recipe and writing and reviewing a standardized recipe. But before we get into the details here, we do have a poll question to involve all of you who have joined us today. So let's go ahead and launch our poll question for the day. It's a pretty simple one, but we wanted to see where all of you are who are in attendance today with standardized recipes. So the question is, how often are you standardizing recipes for your program? Is it frequently, sometimes, rarely, or not yet, but we want to establish a recipe standardization process? So I'll give you a few more seconds to participate in the poll. It's looking like we've got a variety of responses kind of across the board. And I'm happy to see, I don't know actually if you all can see these results yet until I click end poll. But anyway, I'm seeing some good responses in every category. So it's nice to know that, here we go. Okay, I think you can now, the poll has stopped and you can now see the results. So you can see that 45% of you frequently standardize recipes in your programs. 26 are sometimes, 11% rarely, and 18% are not yet, but you'd like to establish the process. So we're happy that you're here to learn more about how to do recipe standardization. So thank you so much for participating in the poll. I'm going to close that. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to Chella Cooper. Welcome, Chella, and thanks.
Hello, Garrett. And hello, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So thank you, Garrett, for that introduction. Hello and buenas a todos to everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. Before I get started, I just wanted to do a few quick disclaimers. First, none of the information shared in this presentation implies a requirement for a USDA child nutrition program. You should always check with your state agency and your program leadership for guidance related to use of standardized recipes, including how they might be used for the administrative review process in your state. Also, I'll be using some examples of recipes that contain major allergens. Please always follow your state and local jurisdiction regulations and practices related to food allergens. Now let's get started. Today, we're talking about the new USDA Recipes Standardization Guide for School Nutrition Programs. While this program is a brand new resource from USDA, the use of standardized recipes in child nutrition programs is not new. Many of you may work in a school that has a binder full of recipes for old favorites that have been used for many decades in your school kitchen. You might even have made some items so many times you no longer need to pull out the recipe every day, but you might use it when you're training a new hire or new staff in your program. There's also been a lot of innovation in the past several years with school nutrition programs incorporating bento-style boxes, bowl concepts, international flavors, grab-and-go items. So many new and exciting things that appeal to the Gen Z and Generation Alpha students eating school meals today. Here are some recent photos posted on social media, shared from child nutrition program professionals throughout the country. Every time I see a beautiful photo like these, there's frequently someone who posts in the comments, "Can you share the recipe?" When we look at a photo of one prepared menu item, we can see the art of school food. The ability to duplicate that menu item so that it's the same every time with the same appealing presentation, the same portion sizes, the same quality and flavor every time, that's the culinary science of school nutrition. And that's where standardized recipes come in. Let's take a moment to look at the USDA formal definition for a standardized recipe. A standardized recipe is one that has been tried, adapted, and retried at least 3 times and has been found to produce the same good results and yield every time when the exact procedures are used with the same type of equipment and the same quality and quantity of ingredients. You'll see this definition right in the beginning of the new USDA guide. I'll point out that there's a difference between standardized recipes and quantity recipes. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. Any recipe that's scaled to produce 25 or more servings can be referred to as a quantity recipe. It could be a recipe for 25 servings or 250 servings or 2,500 servings. Many school nutrition program recipes are quantity recipes. If another program shares their standardized recipe with you, it's a standardized recipe in their program because they've tested it in their kitchen with their ingredients and their equipment at least 3 times, and they were able to achieve consistent results. But for your program, that very same recipe is just a new recipe, and it might be a quantity recipe. It has not been standardized for your operation. For it to become a standardized recipe for your operation, it needs to go through the process of becoming a standardized recipe. It has to be tested at least 3 times with the equipment in your kitchen, the ingredients from your suppliers, and it may require edits or adaptations until you get the same consistent results at least 3 times. Only then can it be called a standardized recipe for your program. When your program has standardized recipes, you know you can count on the quality, the yield, the nutrient content, and the efficiency of labor hours used to prepare and serve the food. There's no guessing when you work with standardized recipes. There are many benefits to using standardized recipes, which are discussed in the new guide. So take a look if you haven't already. Standardized recipes can be used for a lot more than just meal prep in your operation. They can be referenced for cost analysis and forecasting for ordering, or referenced if there's a product recall for one of the ingredients. They can also be used for staff training and much more. From a state agency perspective, your standardized recipes can also be important documents during technical assistance visits and during your administrative review. They can be referenced to demonstrate how the recipe counts towards meal pattern requirements, for crediting of components, and for nutrition information such as calories, sodium, and fat content. Standardized recipes may also include food safety instructions related to critical control points, safe food handling, and food allergens. Check with your state agency if you have any questions about how standardized recipes may be used in your administrative review. I used to do recipe development, and sometimes I would train interns who hadn't written recipes before. I'd start with what I thought was an easy item, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's when I learned that writing a recipe for even a very simple item that you're familiar with might be intimidating. What's great about the new USDA Standardized Recipe Guide is it walks you through the process of how to develop written recipes for your school nutrition program. When I think of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I usually think of some peanut butter and some jelly between 2 slices of bread. But if we took a poll of all of you here on how you made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at home, I bet I would be surprised if any of you use a written recipe when you're at home. When you're making a peanut butter and jelly at home, there's a lot of variety. What kind of bread do you use? Would you use crunchy or creamy peanut butter? Would you use jelly or jam or honey, and how much? That would be a fun exercise for home cooking. But if you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich as part of a reimbursable meal, there needs to be a way to demonstrate how it contributes to the meal pattern. And that's one of the things a standardized recipe can do. It's common for school nutrition folks to share their recipes with one another. And if you don't have a recipe for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and you need one, you might be emailing a friend in another program or opening up a browser window and doing a quick search for a PBJ recipe for NSLP. Here's one that's available from the Mississippi Department of Education website. Let's take a look at it. This recipe has a yield of 96 sandwiches. It uses smooth peanut butter, apple jelly, and enriched Pullman bread. The peanut butter and jelly are combined in a mixer at low speed until blended, then portioned with a number 20 scoop. Top with another slice of bread, and you're done. The recipe lists meal pattern contributions for meat alternate and enriched grain. It shows HACCP information and nutrition information. If you find a recipe like this online that looks like it would be great for your program, you might download it, print it, and stick it in your recipe binder for your school program. But is that recipe a standardized recipe? It might look like a standardized recipe, but for your program, it's not yet. Any recipe you get from any other program may be standardized for their program, but for it to become a standardized recipe for your program, you'll need to take that recipe through the process that's outlined in the new USDA Recipe Standardization Guide. Now that we've looked at what a standardized recipe is and why it's important to use them, let's invite Chef Patrick from the ICN to tell us more about how to standardize recipes for your program using the new USDA Standardized Recipe Guide for Child Nutrition Programs. Chef Patrick, are you there? Hello.
Hello, thank you for that great presentation. Again, my name is Chef Patrick. I'm so happy to be here today to talk to you all about the Recipe Standardization Guide. It was recently published, and we worked diligently with USDA to get this Recipe Standardization Guide perfect for you as operators. I do want to mention at first, I know it's a very detailed guide, but we want to make sure that we have enough information for folks that have never standardized a recipe to be able to utilize it, and seasoned folks to be able to utilize it. So it may seem daunting and overwhelming at first, but for folks that have done recipe standardization for a long time, it may be intuitive. For those that are just new to it, we have a full series of information to help you along your way. So how to access the recipe standardization guide, you can go to the CICN website. There's a link here, or you can go to theicn.org/CICN, and you'll see a tab in the top corner of your screen that says Recipe Standardization Guide, and that will take you to the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide for you to download. We'll also drop a link in the webinar chat, and we'll follow up with an email at the end of this webinar. So the recipe standardization process is made up of a three-phase approach. So the first phase is going through recipe verification. The second is product evaluation. And the third is the quantity adjustment phase. The bulk of this process really revolves around phase one, the recipe verification. So I'll be spending quite a bit of time with you this morning talking about that, but we will be kind of jumping over some of the higher points of it, and Chef Garrett will take you through phases 2 and 3. So phase one is recipe verification, and it consists of identifying the recipe. So that's sourcing it, identifying your ingredients, sourcing your ingredients from your different vendors, making sure that you have the availability of all those ingredients on a regular basis, writing and reviewing the recipe in detail, preparing it in a small batch quantity, verifying its yield in a small batch quantity, and then going back and recording any changes that may have occurred during that initial testing. Our product evaluation phase consists of determining the acceptability of the product from the recipe, and that can be done in 2 parts. One is an informal phase, so that might be done with staff, a few students, just kind of getting basic feedback like, hey, is this recipe heading in the right direction? Are we enjoying it? Is there any modifications we need to make to it, and go back to phase one? If it passes that informal evaluation, then you want to do something a lot stronger, and that's our formal evaluation, and Chef Garrett will touch on that here in a few minutes. Finally, we want to do our quantity adjustment phase, because when we're doing small batch testing, we're doing it in a small scale. So then we want to scale it out, and Chef Garrett will touch on how to do those components as well. So the bulk of phase one really goes into how to build out your recipe the proper way. And so there are numerous components to it here. So we go into areas like the recipe title and description. We want to make sure that the title and description sound appealing to our students. So rather than just steamed green beans, maybe it's sizzling garlic green beans or something like that that really pops and resonates with our students. We want to make sure we're categorizing our recipes the right way so we can easily find them in our recipe catalogs. We want to make sure that we're writing our ingredients in a way that is easily understood by our staff. And we'll go into a little bit of detail on that today. Understanding how to utilize the weight and volume of each ingredient is a very essential component, as well as figuring out the right units of measure to use, and there's details in the guide on that. There's preparation directions. We want to make sure that we're using detailed preparation directions so that our folks understand how to actually prepare these recipes. We insert cooking times, temperatures, and preparation time. Preparation time can help us standardize those recipes to the site so that you understand how long it takes to put together that recipe, which will help menu planners make sure that they're putting together menus with recipes that make sense, looking at the different time constraints and pressures on the kitchen. We also want to make sure that we're having accurate serving sizes and yields. It lists our equipment and tools needed. So that's everything from the type of large appliances you might be using all the way down to your serving utensils, making sure that you have the right size spoodle or scoop that correlates with that recipe to ensure you're getting the correct serving size and that recipe yields the correct portion. Additional information on there will include our crediting information, nutrient analysis, service style. So it might be that this recipe could be served in a variety of ways. Perhaps it's served on your traditional cafeteria line, but maybe it can also be served out of a kiosk or a food truck. So we want to include information on there. Marketing guide allows you to understand how much quantities of raw, unprocessed ingredients to purchase to make that recipe. We also make sure that we include our food safety guidelines. We want to make sure our staff is cooking and handling foods in a safe way. There might be variations to the recipe. So you might have like a taco recipe where all the ingredients are the same, except perhaps the protein. So you might be changing out ground beef for shredded pork, and you can do a variation on there with that. Alternative ingredients. So that might be that you have listed frozen corn and canned corn and how to interchange those. Optional ingredients and a notes section. So that is a lot of information to include in a recipe. Obviously, the more complex the recipe, the more detailed the information needs to be. So if we go and look at our USDA standardized recipes here for a turkey meatloaf, it's a USDA recipe for schools, we can start to identify all those different components on that recipe. We have the name, we have a brief description of what that recipe is. We have our crediting information up on the top area. Then we start to list our ingredients by types. So here we've got brown rice, long grain, regular, dry, parboiled. So that rice is going to cook different than just a regular unparboiled long grain brown rice. So it's important to include that information. We've got the types of pans to use. We've got our weights and volumes that you can use. And we have our clear directions. As we move down through the recipe, we see more of that in here, including our critical control points, time for cooking and the oven temperatures, same with the steamer. As we start to scroll down, we're seeing all these different components added up into the recipe. Again, this is a complex recipe, so there's a lot of different components to it. Finally, we have our nutrient information, we have our marketing guide available, and we have our yield and volume for our different servings. So that, I mean, that's a lot of information, but as we're going through our recipes and going through like administrative reviews or maybe technical assistance, this is the pieces of information that is going to help our state agency reviewers understand what our intended goals are for this recipe. So to hit some high points on the recipe verification of phase 1, that step includes identifying the recipe. So there's tips in there on how to identify recipes within your district. Maybe it's soliciting them from local farmers because you're using local produce. Maybe it's soliciting them an ethnic meal from your community that you want to make sure is resonating with your students. To have comfort food brought into there that's not just what we perceive, someone else might perceive as comfort food, but it might be perceived as others within your community as comfort food. We want to make sure that we're accessible to all. It talks about how to source ingredients. There's information on how to write and review your recipe in detail, which is really critical because we want to make sure we're giving our staff the proper techniques and information to be able to get this job done correctly. How to prepare this in small batches, how to verify the yield, and then how to document and record those changes. So again, phase 1 is very complex, but it really lays the framework for what you're doing in your recipe standardization process. Additional pieces that are really informative and important when we're doing our phase 1 approach is to make sure that we're reviewing the recipes that we're putting together with our production staff. We want to make sure that they understand what we are writing, that they are trained up to understand that, and to make sure that the recipes that we're envisioning being placed in our schools actually work with the equipment, the skill level, and the products that we're able to receive. We want to assess how it's going to be implemented at that production site to make sure it makes sense. And when we include our staff early on, we're going to develop that staff buy-in. They're going to want to be key pieces of the process instead of perhaps being resistant to it, because you're open and listening to what they are saying and getting the feedback from them on how to go through this process and what's going to be served well in your schools. So a few of the high point areas that we want to touch on today include some tips for properly listing ingredients. So instead of just listing carrots, we all know that there might be a lot of different types of carrots out there. You can have frozen, you can have canned, you can have fresh, you can have baby with the fresh, you can have whole carrots with the fresh. So you want to make sure you're identifying what type of ingredient, and then you want to identify the type of technique that might need to be used. So if you're using like whole raw carrots, you might want, you need to include in there that they're going to be sliced in 1/4 inch or diced in 1/4 inch, whatever makes sense for the recipe. So in that listing of ingredients, it would be carrot, raw, 1/4 inch diced. And that way the staff knows that's my prep steps to make sure I get those done. We want to make sure that we're listing our ingredients in the order of use in the recipe. That way it creates a clean roadmap from starting point to end point. It's critical to include the proper units of measure. And one of the things that I like to reiterate consistently is that anything that is not fluid liquid or in small amounts should be measured in weight. Volume should be reserved for fluid liquids and small amounts of dry ingredients. And ingredients may be listed in 1 of 2 forms, but remember to list them in how that product will be consumed, in the form in which it will be consumed. So as purchased, that might be your baby carrots. They're already peeled, put into the right shape. they're good to go there. Edible portion is going to be the amount you need after you minimally process that vegetable. So after you peel, trim the ends, and cut into sizes. And that's where that marketing guide comes into place. So it tells you the amount to purchase. And then on the recipe, you'll have the amount yield that's going to be consumed in the recipe. Another critical piece is making sure that the recipes are written in manageable units of measure. So instead of listing something as 20 ounces, you're going to want to list it as 1 pound, 4 ounces for a couple of reasons. One, listing it at that weight helps people understand that you are talking about weight, not volume. Additionally, it's a lot easier to weigh 1 pound, 4 ounces instead of 20 ounces. Again, when we're talking about fluid, we want to use a half cup versus 8 tablespoons. There's a lot of opportunity for error measuring 8 tablespoons. There's a lot less opportunity for error in half a cup. And these are small amounts. If you extrapolate these out over a large scalable recipe, you end up with a lot more issues and chances for error. So putting it in the manageable units of measure is really important. Additional tips include writing the recipe's preparation directions. So we want to make sure that they're listed very detailed. We want to make sure that they correspond with the ingredients that's being utilized. So the ingredient listed on the left, in the center, your measurable amounts, and then on the right, detailed instructions. And again, you want to make sure they're in order of preparation. You don't want someone to get all the way down to step 7 and then realize step 8 has to do with something they should have done up in step 1 or 2. You want to make sure that the cooking terms are understood by your production team. So it may be that for your site, you need to put something in parentheses. So perhaps it's a julienne cut, but your staff understands it as a fajita slice on a bell pepper. Do what makes sense to your team so that you're getting the proper product at the end. And then include some pre-preparation steps. If you have bulk chicken that's frozen and it needs to defrost before preparation, add a note in there that we're going to defrost this product 3 days prior under refrigeration, or include steps like preheating the oven or starting your steamer early on if it's a pressure steamer to build up all those. And then we also want to make sure that we're always including all of our critical control points in the process to ensure food safety. Some additional tips for writing your preparation directions including your cooking times. Again, we want to make sure the cooking times are used as a guide for timing. We understand that you need to make sure that you're cooking to the proper temperature every single time, but having those cooking times on there are a great guide to get us in the ballpark to start looking at temping those products. If the recipe includes 2 different elements, dressing and salad, separate those sections out. List ingredients that are combined in the same step. So if we're looking at a baking recipe, we'd want to combine all of our wet ingredients together, then all of our dry ingredients, and then have a step on how to incorporate those together. And then include simple ingredient preparations with ingredient descriptions. So again, we're going back to that carrot, but here's another example with some raw yellow onions. So it's onion, yellow onion, raw, 1/4 inch dice, and black beans, canned, drained, rinsed. You might have a recipe that you don't want to rinse those beans, right? And that you want to reserve that liquid. So you might change that instead of rinse to reserve liquid for another step. So it's important to be detailed on those. Additional steps include incorporating the type of cookware and utensils. So here we're highlighting use an 8-quart mixing bowl to complete this step. Or if we're going to put something into a 2-inch stainless steam table pan to cook off, using that 2-inch stainless steel hotel pan, because that's the pan that's going to give us the best yield for what we're looking for, because we might be extrapolating our serving sizes out by X number of servings per pan. We want to make sure that we're including our serving sizes, including our portion utensils, serving containers, and garnishes. Making sure we have the right portion utensils is critical, and outlining that, because it may be something is an 8-ounce portion by weight, but it's a 6-ounce portion by volume. So you want to make sure that you're using a 6-ounce spoodle and not an 8-ounce spoodle. If someone's using an 8-ounce spoodle, they are going to overserve because weight and volume are very different. And then if applicable, if you're using complex food processes, include directions for how to handle the leftovers. Make sure that it's cooled in the right amount of time under the right circumstances. Next, we touch on serving sizes. So we want to make sure that we're listing the serving size in volume and weight. So for an example, and again, this speaks to our issue with the correct serving utensil, serve a half cup, which weighs 2.75 ounces, using a number 8 scoop, because again, weight and volume differ. And then use standardized amounts, such as a half cup or 1 slice, 2 squares each, something that's easily recognizable and easily portioned. Not using the correct portioning tools can lead to a whole host of issues. The one that's most important is unsatisfied customers. Again, this is the hospitality industry, so we want to make sure that we're treating our customers the way they would be treated at any other restaurant. So we want to make sure that they're getting the correct size portions and that there's enough to ensure that they are fed at the end of meals. And if we're doing that, all of our other issues, including labor costs, food costs, making sure that we're following our nutrient analysis and our crediting, that all gets eradicated because we're making sure that we're serving the right amount and keeping our customers happy. And that refers back to yield, making sure that the final product and the finished product yields exactly what we're looking for every time, because we follow the same steps and same processes to get us from step A to step Z. Again, additional tips for listing equipment and tools. We want to make sure we're listing all those cooking and serving equipment. We want to include equipment specific to your program. So one of the reasons that we might want to standardize recipes to a site is that one site might have a blender that's a stand blender, one might have an immersion blender. There might be different ways to approach that. You might have different types of ovens in your site. So one site might have a combi oven that you can use different settings. Another one might have a conventional oven, and another might have a convection oven. So they're all going to cook at a little different rates of speed and temperature. So you want to make sure that you're adjusting to adapt to those needs at the different sites. If all your sites have the same equipment, they're getting the same product, you don't have to do it by the site. But if you have variations of the type of equipment and type of product coming into your sites, you need to re-standardize to each of your sites. Our crediting information is one of the most important parts on our recipes, so that when we're getting administrative reviews or technical assistance, it can easily be identified. Is this meeting meal pattern? And it also correlates over to your production records. So being able to look at a recipe, say this credits as X, Y, and Z, and your production record supports that. If you're having trouble with putting together the proper crediting information, we have a series of online trainings that help support you to use the Food Buying Guide and Recipe Analysis Workbook. So you can visit ICN at our iLearn. So there's a QR code here available for you. And currently we have an overview of the Food Buying Guide. We also have how to utilize the Recipe Analysis Workbook. And finally, we have product formulation statements. So these are great online learnings that help you understand how to utilize this resource and take it to the next level. So I am now going to turn it over to Chef Garrett, and he is going to take you through phases 2 and 3. Chef Garrett.
Thanks, Chef Patrick. Much appreciated. Okay, so picking up with phase 2 of the recipe standardization process, we have small, so product evaluation is phase 2. So we want to consider small batch taste testing. So once your recipe has been verified, you want to do a test kitchen in a sense. So create a small batch of the recipe, say 25 servings per batch. You want to make notes as you're going along. And also note that procedures for conducting a formal evaluation can be found in the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide for school nutrition programs. So there's the informal, which may be more with your staff or a small group of staff members, and a more formal evaluation will have probably a template for. There will be an evaluation form, is what I'm trying to say, and there are templates within the resource that can get you started with an evaluation form. So then based on the formal evaluation results, the recipe will either be accepted as it is, rejected, or changed. So of course, if the recipe is a huge success in that group, then the recipe is considered standardized. If the evaluation comments come in poor, then you might want to scrap the recipe altogether. You kind of have a meeting to discuss, like, is this recipe worth pursuing any further? Do we want to tweak it? And if the consensus is no, then you can scrap that recipe. And that happens, right? That happens sometimes. And then finally, if the evaluation comments are inconclusive, you might consider doing a little bit of additional work. So hopefully the evaluationers will have some feedback, such as maybe not enough flavor, or maybe the texture is off a little bit. So you could look at ways to change the way the recipe is produced and make yet another update to the recipe. So moving into phase 3, that was kind of a brief synopsis of phase 2. There's a lot more details in the recipe standardization guide. So moving quickly into phase 3, the quantity adjustment, you can use a number of different methods to adjust the quantity. So say you're testing the recipe initially at 25 servings or thereabouts. So you may need to adjust the quantity up if you have a very large school district, or maybe down if you're a very small district. So there's different methods. The factor method is the most common method, but there's 3 others: the direct reading tables method, percentage method, and computerized recipe adjustments. Those would be like if you're using a nutrition analysis software and you put the recipe into the software, then the software can typically scale up or down based on whatever the yield needs are that you're looking for. So a lot more detail on the various methods are found in the recipe standardization guide. So I would urge you to check that out. And in case you missed it, while Chef Patrick was speaking, I did place a link to the webpage where you can download a copy of the recipe standardization guide into the chat. So if you can open chat, you'll find that link and you can click that and go to the recipe standardization guide. Also, in the email that you'll receive after this webinar, there will be a link to that guide as well. So speaking of scaling, if you're unfamiliar with or you need to brush up on scaling recipes, we do have an online course through our iLearn portal. It's Basic Culinary Math, Scaling Recipes. So you can certainly check that out. You can simply go to www.theicn.org and then click on the blue iLearn link or button at the top of the page to get there. You could use this QR code if you're a quick draw with your cell phones and want to take a picture. But again, that's www.theicn.org and click on that blue iLearn button. So furthering on in phase 3, you get to the school meal service pilot. So eventually the evaluating student acceptability. This is the final step in the quantity adjustment phase. It's to evaluate the acceptability of the recipe with the larger school community during meal service. So this is kind of a test run. This is your chance to debut the new recipe to key stakeholders in your school nutrition program, such as your students, building faculty, support staff, and your own staff in the kitchen. So conducting student surveys is useful when piloting a new recipe. And you can find templates within the USDA recipe standardization guide for gathering feedback. Finally, staff training is critical when rolling out new recipes, of course. Not only are you piloting the new recipe with students at this point, your staff are also likely seeing the recipe prepared in quantity for the first time. You want to be sure that you have met staff training needs for every new menu item. In-person and or video trainings can familiarize your staff with how to prepare and serve the new item. And I certainly have done my share of in-person and video training videos for new recipes and new menu items. So make sure that your staff have been fully trained before they attempt to execute the new menu item. So we are lucky to have some additional time. Let me do a quick recap of what we've covered so far. To review, we've defined standardized recipe and why we use them. We discussed how to standardize a recipe using the three-phase approach, and we discussed some of the details included in writing and reviewing a standardized recipe. But those are only some of the highlights from the new USDA Recipe Standardization Guide. You'll find many additional resources in the guide and in the appendix, including USDA Standardization USDA Standardized Recipe Template, informal evaluation checklist, food production or food product evaluation forms, quality scorecards, taste test survey template, culinary terms and definitions, and recipe conversion charts. We covered a lot today in a short amount of time, and we didn't even touch on the majority of what's found in the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide. So thank you for hearing what we had to show or what we had to present today. We're not done. We're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A section of the webinar. So I'd like to invite Chella and Chef Patrick back out to the webinar for Q&A.
Hello.
Welcome back. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes.
Glad to be here.
Terrific. Okay. Well, we have had we've had several great questions come through on Q&A, and I would like to go ahead and jump into some of those. Well, before we get to those, actually, I have a couple of questions. So first of all, Chella, I think you covered this pretty well. You shared some really good information, but what is a state agency looking for in a standardized recipe during an administrative review?
That is a very common question, and I've heard people from a lot of different states ask that question. And my answer is always check with your state agency, because different state agencies will look at those standardized recipes and use them in different ways. But typically, you can expect that they might be looking for things like for the week of review, where they're looking at your menus for the entire week period that they're reviewing. They're going to be looking at those recipes for the calorie and other nutrition content, because it's got to be within the parameters of the guidelines and limits for a week's worth of menus. They're looking for crediting information. Does each item meet the requirements for each meal component? I'm going to go back to the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If your peanut butter and jelly sandwich only counts as a one meat alternate, what other meat alternate are you serving with that product to make it meet the two meat alternate requirement? So there's a variety of different ways that they can be used. Again, check with your state agency. And most state agencies are good about giving information about what they're looking for and providing technical assistance.
Thank you. And Chef Patrick, I wanted to ask you, because you've had such good experience as a former director, but how long do you think one could expect the process to take from start to finish standardizing a recipe?
Well, that's a great question, Chef, and thank you for that. It depends on the complexity of the recipe itself. So a very simple recipe, like let's say it's a chicken patty sandwich, that's maybe a chicken patty, a slice of cheese, a bun. Those are very quantifiable and easy to go through the process of. It basically just putting together very simple ingredients. It's good to have a standardized recipe for that, though, because you might have different equipment at your different sites. You want to make sure you're preparing it in a way that makes sense to that site. Now, a more complex, like a chili, might take a little bit longer because you're trying to find the nuanced spices, the steps and processes that make sense for your students, and making sure that you're capturing the proper yields. So there's no direct answer on that question. I guess the more straightforward the recipe, the less time it takes. The more complex the recipe is, the longer that process may take.
Perfect. One of the questions that came through the Q&A feature is, should recipes be standardized for our programs before putting them on our menus? Patrick, would you like to address that?
In theory, yes, absolutely. Is it always practical? That depends on your program and what you're doing. You might utilize a run of it to do a formal, taste testing, because you have limited time, budget, ingredients, what have you. So size and scope really depend. It could be that maybe you run it as a limited time offer on a line to test it out, and it's not your primary meal served that day, but it's an opportunity to get feedback and garner feedback from students. So I look at it as find opportunities to solicit feedback from your students, but don't make it the only option available that day if you have not had an opportunity to standardize it yet.
Great. Those are good tips. Another a question came through while Chella was presenting about the benefits of a standardized recipe. And the question is, how does it affect meals per labor hour? And Chella, I think you had a good thought on that.
Yeah, there are a few things that came to mind when with regard to how it affects meals per labor hour. When there's new staff coming on into a kitchen and you're trying to get them up to speed, if there aren't any standardized recipes for products, and this is not just in school nutrition programs, but if you're working in the restaurant industry or hospitality industry, it takes time to do a demo for that person to show them how to make it. And to explain all the different parts. If there are many components, they may need to take notes so that they can create that dish in a way that meets the requirements and the expectations of your customers, your students. So by having a standardized recipe, it prevents any negative impact on your meals per labor hour, particularly when you're bringing on when you're training new staff. And also if you're rolling out new recipes, when you can do a training with one recipe, you can train all of your staff at one time, and then they can reference back to it when they're preparing it in their operation.
I would also like to add too, it helps with your meals per labor hour, because when you're using standardized recipes, your staff becomes accustomed to utilizing those recipes, and they find ways in how they gather their equipment, how they pre-prepare items. They start talking to each other, and it's like, hey, I got a bunch of peppers, you got a bunch of peppers, I got a bunch of onions, you got a bunch of onions. Instead of me doing both and you doing both, let's do them together, and finding ways to collaborate and streamline some processes because they know what's coming up. So in conjunction with cycle menus, standardized recipes can drastically reduce or help your meals per labor hour because your staff is accustomed to producing those recipes.
Yeah, excellent. So positive effect, if anything, on meals per labor hour. A clarification question is here. This came in around the time that we were talking about the need to standardize a recipe to your program and to your district and potentially to your school and the equipment. So the question is, does this mean each school in our district needs their own standardized recipe?
I'll take this one. I think if the equipment and products that are at each site vary, then you're going to need a different recipe for that site. If you have the sites with the same product coming in, the same equipment being utilized, the same steps being utilized, and you're getting the same consistent results, then no, you do not need to standardize it to every single site. But if you have variations of equipment, you may need to do that. So, be very cognizant of what you're doing, because you might have a school that's got an old stove or an old oven that no one's replaced, and it burns at 500 degrees, and a new convection oven, and even using a prefabricated heat and serve pizza, they're going to cook at different times and different rates. So you need to standardize those recipes to meet the moment.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point with the heat and serve pizzas. If a large school district has combi ovens in one kitchen and warming cabinets in another, there's two different pieces of equipment, and you would want to specify in the recipe which piece of equipment to use, because that's going to be there's a lot of detail around that, the temperature, the cooking time, etc.
Yeah.
I would
additionally,
also
please.
I would also add there would be opportunities to make slight differences in recipes that might be used in the elementary school versus in the high school. There are, if you had a taco salad that was really popular among all of your schools, but the elementary school students didn't like it quite so spicy, you could indicate that and make those variations during the standardization process. You wouldn't need to standardize it. So even if it's the same equipment, it might just be a slight change to a seasoning or one ingredient.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a larger school district, you might have different ethnic communities. You might need to standardize it to different palatability of those communities, Additionally, if you're doing different serving sizes, you want to make sure that your standardized recipe to make sure you're getting the correct serving size and yield. So K5 is going to be different than 6-8, different than 9-12. So those are other areas where you may need to be adjusting the recipes in order, re-standardizing them to make sure that they meet the need of that serving site.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm looking at our upvotes on the questions, and the one that has the most upvotes at this point is the question, are there software or tools that can help facilitate or automate recipe standardization during the quantity adjustment phase?
I'll take this, I guess.
That sounds good. I can, yeah, please do.
Lots of crickets. Yes, there is software that does that, and there's approved software by the USDA that does that. And I'm not going to mention any specific ones by name. I would caution you though that some of those programs do not do what we would term culinary math. So they might just do straight line changes in the amounts of product, and so it might be that you have a recipe for 25 that calls for a half teaspoon of salt. And then when it gets extrapolated out to 2,500 servings, it's calling for whatever the yield factor is times, a half teaspoon. And you end up with just an overblown amount of salt, because as you scale it, sometimes you don't need as much salts and herbs and those things. So I would, if you're going to utilize that format, I would definitely be testing it throughout the process and slowly making additions of your seasonings, specifically salt and any of your more potent seasonings, to make sure that you're not getting something that's not palatable at the end.
That's a really good point when you scale up. Absolutely. Another question that has come up is, this guide is directed towards school nutrition programs. Will there be a guide on standardizing recipes for CICFP, or is there can CICFP programs use this guide as well?
I would 100% say that you could utilize this guide for CICFP programs. We are in the process of identifying one that meets those needs a little bit differently, because this one goes into a lot of more technical aspects of crediting information for schools specifically, but the processes are very much the same. You want to make sure you have the correct information on there. You want to be testing it with your students. You want to be testing it with your staff. So all those processes are going to be very, very much the same.
Mm-hmm. We have time for just a couple more questions. This one's a good question that I think maybe a lot of people might wonder sometimes. So the question is, so how is chili measured or credited? By weight or by volume? And I would say, for a serving, in a recipe for a serving, you'd probably call for a serving by volume for a chili recipe, because it's a semi-fluid food, and so you would probably choose a volume like a half cup or 1 cup as the volume. Crediting chili would be a whole different process, but you would need to use the recipe analysis workbook to credit the recipe. You would also, in order to do so, you would need to know the yield of the recipe as well, and what you are hoping to get as a yield for crediting that recipe. So in that example, I'd say volume.
Yeah, so best practice, and Garrett's right along the right lines, is when you're getting your full yield, it is best practice to make sure that you weigh it to ensure that you're getting the proper weight of it. But then when it comes to portioning, you want to use volume because it is liquid. So an example would be if you make a 55-gallon batch of that chili, placing it into, let's say, 4-inch full-size hotel pans, and then capturing the weight of each of those pans and saying, this 4-inch hotel pan of chili has 25 8 fluid ounce servings in it, and that credits as, let's say it's a 2 MMA, quarter cup legume, quarter cup tomato. So red, orange. So it's good to use both. I think capturing weight is always important because weight is always consistent, volume is not.
It's I'm sure there are a lot of people that have a lot of questions about crediting with standardized recipes when they're writing the recipe. How can they make sure that they're including the correct information to make it easy for when folks are preparing it in the kitchen, but also to capture that. Does it demonstrate that it's meeting the requirements? And, today we're going over an introduction to how to use this guide. And I think questions like that are very important, but that's really a deep dive. I think that could be a whole webinar topic, maybe even a podcast, video series. There's a bunch of ways to do that. So
yeah, absolutely. And we are in the process of developing an online virtual workshop where we're working small cohorts of 12 to walk menu planners or chefs or whoever does the recipe development within your district through the recipe standardization process. So we'll be piloting that in the near future. If you're interested in being a participant in that pilot, please feel free to reach out to me at chef@theicn.org, and we'll get your name on a list.
Perfect. And just to reiterate a point, this is the first time a resource like this has existed. And it's very exciting and it answers a lot of questions. And so I hope that you are able to take some time to review the resource. And if you do have questions, please contact us at the ICN, and absolutely contact your state agency specialists as well. And they can help answer any questions about standardized recipes and using this resource.
Yeah, and please don't hesitate to use the help desk at theicn.org and direct those questions to Chef Garrett or myself, and we will get back to you with an answer and be able to maybe even jump on a Zoom meeting between two of us and kind of walk through some of those questions and strategies. I would say, first understanding how to utilize the food buying guide and recipe analysis workbook is always a critical first step. So if you haven't had the opportunity, please go ahead and take those courses online. And we also have the culinary math courses, which again are critical first steps in understanding how to do some of the scaling practices we've discussed.
Definitely. Are there any other questions, Chella or Chef Patrick, that you wanted to get to, but we haven't yet before we move on?
I think there have been a lot of really great questions. I think we could go on for some time, but I know we're pressed for time. So
yeah, thank you. We do like to keep it within the hour. I think we've just squeaked over the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and do the final wrap up of this webinar. So I will invite all of you to join us on our next CICN webinar that will take place on Thursday, September 1st. It will be a panel discussion on procurement strategies for the 2022-23 school year. So please mark your calendars for that and join us. I also want to direct you to our back to school toolbox. We have some really great resources compiled for you that are specific to your back to school training needs. So visit theicn.org/back-to-school. The web address is right there on the screen. So that's our back to school toolbox. I also want to bring to your attention our new Shaking It Up resources from the ICN. You can find that at theicn.org/shaking-it-up. And these are small changes that lead to big flavors. This is all about enhancing flavor while reducing sodium on your school menus. So take a look at the great resources that are available at theicn.org/shaking-it-up. And please always check out the Child Nutrition Recipe Box and the Child Nutrition Sharing site for more resources for your programs. We now have Child Nutrition Recipe Box recipes available in Spanish. The whole website is in Spanish language translated. So please check that out as well. And finally, please like and subscribe, or whatever you say for following on social media. The ICN, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. So please make sure that you follow us through all those channels. We're so grateful that you've joined us today. And I would like to thank Chella Cooper from the Maryland State Department of Education for joining Chef Patrick and I today to share their expertise. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. This concludes today's webinar. Have a good day.